Hi, this is Paul. It's Friday, so it's rough draft for Sunday time, where I walk through the current draft of my sermon. For some of you who've been watching my Jordan Peterson videos, you'll notice things come in, and that's pretty normal for me. What I think about during the week almost always winds its way into the sermon, and so for some of you that might be a beneficial thing. Part of over the last 6 months, been doing all these Jordan Peterson videos. My congregation hears a little bit about it, gets a little interested, so it's a way of me bringing my worlds together in a way. So this past week last weekend was, of course, the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson conversation, and I listened to a bunch of things from the both of them to try and get ready. And one of the common complaints or criticisms that I hear sometimes from the skeptic, whatever label you want to put on that group of people, is certain things aren't in the Bible. There isn't a no slavery rule, or there isn't a no nukes rule, or something like this, and surely God would put those things in the Bible. Now, there's not really a don't be corrupt. Well, I'll ask you, is there a don't be corrupt rule in the Bible? If you do a little Bible search, see right away when I do this, it's like, I got to rearrange my slides. So that's why I do a rough draft. So you can search corrupt and look at all the words, instances of corrupt, at least in the various English translations I have easily at my disposal. You can even search for the word bribe, but bribery isn't corruption. Corruption is a far broader word, and it's actually a fairly important word if you look for it in the Bible. So if there is a don't be corrupt rule, it's kind of similar to Google's don't be evil rule. Doesn't matter. If the Bible does have a don't be corrupt rule, will people change their behaviors? If the Bible doesn't have a don't be corrupt rule, does it mean, well, look at that edit there too. Go back to the beginning of the slide. If the Bible does have a don't be corrupt rule, will it change people's behaviors? A lot of times when I listen to often people who are not in the church, but even people who are in the church, sometimes they'll say, Pastor, you should get up on the pulpit and tell people to stop doing that. And I think, is that going to make them stop? We have all kinds of rules in the Bible about not doing this and not doing that. Don't commit adultery is a pretty clear one, and people do it all the time. Where we're going with this is the limitations of rules. So if the Bible does have a don't be corrupt rule, will people change their behaviors? A little bit, to a degree, to some degree. My point is that this business about rules and behavior is a very complicated business. What we often usually do, if there's something we want to do that breaks a rule, what we usually wade in with is a justification, where we will say, well, normally this is the rule, but I am justified in breaking the rule for these reasons. So, for example, I am justified in committing adultery because my spouse doesn't understand me, or we've fallen out of love, or they've done it first, or they've done this thing that has hurt me, therefore this is getting back. Committing adultery is justice. But this gets into the question about religion, and is religion hooey? Now, there are a lot of assumptions about both how the Bible works and its content that bring people to one conclusion or another. Some people who argue against the Bible are very knowledgeable about the Bible, others aren't. Some people who argue that we shouldn't listen to the Bible might know a lot about the Bible, but might not know a lot about how the Bible actually functions in specific religious communities. And you also have the fact that the Bible functions differently in different specific religious communities, even within the same culture, and that the Bible functions differently within different religious communities across different cultures. It's all a very complicated situation, and it is not the case that there's a rule in the Bible, therefore Christians obey the rule. That's clearly not the case. Christians break their own rules all the time. Christians even break the rules that they develop that aren't in the Bible. So this business about rule making doesn't really hold. The conclusions they come to aren't always massively deterministic about their lives. I regularly hear people say, well, it's always my rule to never speak against anyone else, and then they go right ahead and speak against other people. I'm doing this class in the epistles of John, and the epistles of John are famous for having these most amazing passages about love one another, and God is love, is in 1 John, and love, 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 love. And then a verse later it turns around, but don't even talk to these other people. In fact, they're of the devil, and despise them, and don't give them the time of day, and don't associate with them. And Raymond Brown in his commentary, that's a little far for me to reach, Raymond Brown in his commentary brings this up and says, on one hand, no place in the Bible is more filled with love, 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 love. And then he turns around and says, and don't even associate with these other people, because they are, and it's kind of like, wait a minute, you're in the same book. And so skeptics rightly point this out and say, the Bible shouldn't be followed. It's inconsistent. How could the Word of God be so inconsistent? Well, if Sam Harris, who is an atheist, and one of the things that we recognize about this is that it's not the case that Sam Harris is an evil, awful person because he's an atheist. If Sam Harris, I don't know a lot about Sam Harris, but if Sam Harris were my neighbor, he seems like a perfectly honest, trustworthy man. I would give him my house keys and ask him to take in the mail while I was on vacation, and maybe let he and his wife babysit my children. And was I just sexist for bringing his wife in to babysit? I'd let Sam Harris, if my kids were still little, I'd let Sam Harris babysit my children. I've had many atheist friends in my life, and I let them babysit my children, and I lent them my car, and they had keys to my house, and I would trust them with as confidants. And they're atheists. Does that mean they're not trustworthy? No. Now, to a degree, Jordan Peterson says, ha, you're not atheists. And they, of course, are offended, and round and round and round we go about that. But we would imagine that if all of this stuff about the Bible and rules and atheism and them having a different moral structure, which I might be skeptical about, that this would somehow deeply impact behavior, and it just doesn't seem to hold true. So then people kind of flip around and say, all of this stuff, none of this stuff is important whether you're a Christian or an atheist. You're all the same. It's the culture you were born into. But then again, if you start looking closely at that, you see, no, our beliefs, our commitments, our communities, our religions, in fact, do, often over long periods of time, often over multiple generations, actually impact what we do and how we relate to one another. Now, CNN is not my lectionary, and so I always get a little annoyed when people say, you should preach a sermon on this thing, Pastor. Is this corruption? One of the things that we deal with is the question, okay, what is corruption? And you'll find that people very quickly differ on corruption. Last week's big news was family separation at the border. This week it's Anthony Kennedy and his retirement. Anthony Kennedy is a C.K. McClatchy alum. Some of my kids went to C.K. McClatchy, and as a parent, I helped with the band. So they're very proud of that. Anthony Kennedy comes from Sacramento, so there have been a lot of articles about Anthony Kennedy in the Bee. But now when Obama was president, the Republican-controlled Senate didn't bring his Supreme Court nominee up for a vote. And, well, was that right or wrong? Was that corrupt? Was that, well, it was a legal gray area. Now, they might rush through Trump's nominee before the midterms. And today I saw all of these articles about, well, Anthony Kennedy's son is a big wheel at Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank has loaned Donald Trump a lot of money, so is there a conspiracy theory about this? Is there corruption? And so even if you had a rule that said don't be corrupt, does that necessarily cast a lot of light onto all of this? Because just as I said earlier, it's not that people don't know what rules are, and it's not that if there's a rule, people will follow it, and it's not just simply that if there's a rule, people will break it. People are a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced when it comes to rules. And so what people usually do is say, yeah, there's this rule, but I'm going to break it, and my breaking it is justified. In that, to a certain degree, we maintain our own egos. So what exactly is corruption? Well, that's not terribly hard to define. We do what is in our personal self-interest rather than what is good or right for others, or right in history, or right for your group, or right for the world. Sometimes we further our own agendas over fair process. And so when you look at the Anthony Kennedy thing, that's kind of what people are debating. Well, what's fair? Well, fair is so often in the eye of the beholder, especially if you don't imagine there is a God who will finally hold us to account over what is fair. But then we might argue that, well, we couldn't know what was fair because we didn't have all the information, and we couldn't see it from their perspective, and so on and so forth. Corruption, the opposite of corruption, is, in a sense, your well-being at my expense. And those of you who've been listening to my sermons for a very long time know this is a favorite catchphrase for me. There's this polarity, my well-being at your expense and your well-being at my expense. And so really, when it comes down to corruption, it's the question, can you say no to yourself for the sake of others, for the sake of right and wrong, for the sake of good and evil? Now, last week we looked at the purge of Jehu, and we've been taking a long time looking at 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and we've seen kind of the rise and the fall of the Messianic kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament. And when we look at Solomon, we kind of have a lesson in corruption. Now, the Solomon story is sort of archetypal in that Solomon becomes the wisest man in the world, but then the wisest man in the world gets corrupted. Now, part of this is how the Hebrews understood wisdom. Wisdom was understood in terms of excellence. It was understood in terms of skill. It was understood in terms of capacity and competence. More necessary. That's a very big discussion that we don't have time to get into. But here's a question. Is this story more helpful to us in convicting us, informing us, letting us know about our lives and corruption than necessarily a list of rules? That's a complicated question, because if Solomon had a rule, no marrying foreign women, maybe that would have kept corruption at bay. If Solomon had other rules, maybe that would have kept corruption at bay. David was going to build the temple. God said no. Solomon built the temple. If Rehoboam had a rule about laws and taxes, maybe he could have saved his kingdom. Or maybe if he had a rule, always listen to your elders. But that's a hard thing, because sometimes the elders are wrong. So right there you see there's a tension between the value of rules and the value of stories. Now, as a pastor, I often find that people have assumptions about the Bible. And the broadest assumption that I hear regularly is that the Bible is a book of rules and laws. And if you keep God's rules and laws, God will bless you and reward you here and in heaven. And if you break the rules, God will punish you here in heaven. Now, there are passages that say similar things, and there are passages that say things that are in tension with those things. But again, I find that many, many people, both Christians and non-Christians, kind of assume the Bible is that way. But now if you pick up a Bible, and I suppose I could do it, I have lots of Bibles in my office, even though I seldom open them, not because I don't open Bibles, but because I almost always use the Bible in my computer. If you would look at the Bible, you would say, okay, what portion of the Bible, Charles Stanley Life Principles Bible. People give me Bibles sometimes too. If you would open the Bible and say, well, what part of the Bible has rules in it? Well, let's maybe start in the middle of Exodus, and there's a lot of rules in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's not only rules, but there's a lot of rules. And so we might say that the part of the Bible that emphasizes, that has rules, is kind of in here. Almost the whole rest of the Bible is not primarily rules. Most of the rest of the Bible are narratives, stories, wisdom, prophetic complaints, poetry, letters, correspondence. Now, there are various little rules tucked in amongst those things, but only a tiny, tiny portion of the Bible itself actually are lists of rules. And that's really helpful and important to think about. Now, quite famously, Christianity and Judaism have a little bit of tension over this, because Judaism works a little bit differently than Christianity when it comes to rules. But so even illustrations of good and bad aren't necessarily reductive with this. And again, a very common approach to the Bible in Sunday school. Oh, Dell wants to do updates. Oh, lovely. Little computer glitch right there. So one way people read the Bible is a list of rules that you have to keep. Another way people read the Bible is the Bible are a bunch of stories with people with black hats and white hats, and the Bible illustrates the good guys from the bad guys, the heroes from the villains. The problem with that approach to reading the Bible is it also doesn't follow the Bible. If you actually read about Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and Joseph and David and Samuel, it's very hard, in fact, to find perfect people in the Bible. Some of your greatest heroes are truly scoundrels. David on his dying bed is like, don't tell Solomon, keep the covenant to the Lord, and oh yeah, kill all my enemies that I haven't bothered to kill. Even all my scores. And so right after David dies, there's a small little bloodbath where Solomon cleans up the messes after David. And of course, David and Bathsheba, he kills Bathsheba's husband to cover up the affair, and on and on and on and on. That's the story of the Bible, and that's how the Bible works. Now, the only exception to that is, of course, Jesus, but that gets into a whole nother theological category. The Bible is not a simplistic book of rules or heroes that we are supposed to emulate, even if often Sunday school literature will do this. You'll hear a lot of this in churches. I don't think that's actually what's in the Bible, and I think I've got a pretty good case if you actually read the Bible. And what this leads us to are a whole bunch of paradoxes. Life is complex, and life is simple. Good and evil are clear. Sometimes it's hard to know the right thing to do in a given circumstance. We all know this, but which way we see it is often contextual, and that's why people will say, well, I know there's this no adultery rule, but, as long as my wife doesn't know, it'll be okay. I really need this. My marriage will be better if I have a mistress. Just sit down with real people and talk to them, and our capacity for justifying something that is against a rule is phenomenal. This introduction may be too long for this sermon. That was 15 minutes. I always have a problem with introductions that go on too long. That's kind of why it's kind of nice to do a little video, because YouTube doesn't have a clock on it, and I have to whittle it down before Sunday. So what we have here in 2 Kings 11 is, in fact, a story of corruption. And in Jehu's purge, last week we talked about the fact that Israel basically folds because it is corrupt. And all the king's servants have no loyalty to him because they're only loyal to themselves, because the king is only loyal to himself, and the queen is only loyal to herself. And when you have a hierarchy or a structure or an institution that everyone is only in it for themselves, this is almost the definition of corrupt, because someone who is not corrupt, puts the needs of the institution or the group or the nation or the god or whatever authority figure ahead of their own. That is basically the definition of not being corrupt. Well, Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, who Jehu has just killed, saw that her son was dead. She proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. In other words, okay, my son is dead, I'm seizing the throne, and I'm going to kill anyone who could be a threat to me. Now, right away, here we have to ask the question, which country has a no-killing rule? When we talk to people and talk about, well, right and wrong and morality, that seems pretty universal. Well, if there's a near universal moral code, it's usually don't kill. Well, has that stopped us from killing? No. And right away, Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, when she learns that her son, the king, is dead, thinks, I'm in charge now. Now, what's interesting is, if you've been following the story, you know that Athaliah is a daughter of Jezebel. And so what, in a sense, we've seen is that corruption has been spreading from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom. Now, if I would pull up that concordance list of uses of corrupt in the Bible, one of the things that you would see is that in biblical language, corruption tends to spread. It spreads between people because, and this isn't hard to figure out, because when we're in a group and we figure out that the people in the group are valuing themselves and taking advantage of the group and using the group for their own welfare and placing themselves ahead of the welfare of the group, well, that's called corruption. And pretty soon everybody starts to do it. And this is a very delicate thing in terms of institutions. Once the people in the institution are corrupt or get a sense that the institution is corrupt, the institution falls because the institution is built on trust. And if everybody in the institution is just using things to get their own way, everything falls apart. And what we saw in Jehu's purge was that someone would come up to Jehu and say, are you loyal to the king? And Jehu would say, be loyal to me. And they almost always would fall in line. Why? The king was corrupt. Well, to what degree was the king corrupt? Well, this is where corruption goes all the way up. And if there's no up there above the king, if in fact, this is where we get into Baal worship, if in fact all Baal is a petty tyrant who is looking for allegiance and offerings and will kick down dependent on what everyone is kicking up, well, that then impacts who the king is. And so it makes a great deal of difference what's at the top of your hierarchy. And that, when it comes to these stories and kings, is deeply embedded in the system. I can already tell that my situation here will be quite long. And yeah, the video is going to be longer than the sermon. I'm going to have to do a lot of editing in this thing. But now something happens. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, and the sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes. Now you might say, well, would a baby be missing? But now let's pay attention. When we saw what happened in the northern kingdom, one of the things that these kings do is proliferate the number of wives and the number of sons so that they can guarantee themselves a legitimate heir. Now, King Henry VIII didn't have the possibility of polygamy, so he kept offing his wives. So apparently there was a new baby born that Athaliah might not have heard about, and the mother and the daughter conspire to save their child. So she put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed, and he remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. Now in the seventh year, Jehoiada sent for the commanders of the units of 100, the Karites and the guards that had been brought to him at the temple of the Lord. He made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. Now pay attention to what's happening here. Pay attention to what's happening here, even though I'm not paying attention. I'm looking at the messages coming into my watch. Maybe I'm corrupt. What's going on here? Well, what kings often had was an elite bodyguard. This elite bodyguard were often from a particular tribe, and in David's case, they were often not even Israelites. They were loyal specifically to him more than the tribe. Now this becomes very important for David when he fights the civil war against his son Absalom, because what we saw again and again is that this close-knit group of mighty men that were loyal to David, who came around David in his exile years when he was fleeing from Saul. Boy, I could run this sermon so many different ways. This text is so rich, and it's a text that nobody ever pays any attention to because it ties all these different places. So again, I can talk about this on the video. My challenge is I'm going to have to pare this down for the sermon. Maybe I'll start with the story. I don't know. In other words, this sermon is very much in flux. So what happens, so let's go back to David. So what happens with David is, if you recall, David is not corrupt. David faces down against Goliath when all of Israel is on the verge of corruption because Saul is corrupt, because Saul is disconnected from the Lord, who is in fact the top of the hierarchy, where there is no corruption, because again, corruption always spreads and it bleeds. And so Saul is corrupt, and Saul is hiding in his tent instead of facing Goliath. And David goes up and he basically says, me and God, I believe in the Lord. And if God doesn't save me, ha, but I'm not going to let this Philistine do this. Boom. There's the opposite of corruption. And then Saul elevates him. David is uncorruptible. Saul figures, I'll give you my daughter. I'll bring you into my corruption. David is not corruptible. David's corruption will come later. And so Saul then wants to kill him. Well, what does Jehu do? Well, Jehu, his life isn't even in danger, and he kills those above him. What is Athaliah doing? Well, she's kicking down. Again, the way the world works is kick down, kiss up. Well, Athaliah kicks down, tries to kill all her relatives. Yeah, this is a great thing. Tries to kill all her relatives to preserve her power. Well, nobody's loyal to him. Well, where does the insurrection come from? It comes from the temple. So the priest class conspires with the bodyguard. Now we didn't get any commentary here on the reign of Athaliah, but judging from the lack of loyalty to her, she was probably enormously corrupt, and everybody knew she was a bad queen, and people hated her, or maybe it was the patriarchy that wanted to see her downfall because she was a woman. I don't know. There's no speculation of it, and there's no talk about it in the text. But basically, a coup gets formed, and it's between Jehoiada, the priest, and the bodyguards. And so, wow, this is a real problem for Athaliah. And Jehoiada basically says, okay, summon yourself around the king. He's 7 years old. We're going to have him take power. But you've got a 7-year-old taking power, putting the king in power by the high priest. Well, who's really going to be in control? Well, the high priest. Is this going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on the high priest. Well, we'll see the high priest. And then the question is the high priest preparing the boy to be a good king? So the guards, each with weapon in hand, stationed themselves around the king, near the altar in the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put a crown on him. Remember, if you know anything about Napoleon, who crowns Napoleon after the French Revolution? Napoleon. Well, this is much more typical. You know, the Pope crowns Charlemagne. The priest crowns King Joash. They anoint him. The priest anoints Joash. Not a prophet, interestingly enough. Where are the prophets? Have they all been killed? And the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" So you have the royal bodyguards, you have the priestly class, and now you have the citizens of Jerusalem. Nobody liked Athaliah, the daughter of the Tyrian Baal. That's where she came from. She came from Tyre. When Athaliah heard the noise made by the guards and the people, she went to the people at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing the trumpets. Athaliah tore her robes and cried out, "Treason! Treason!" This is in a sense the height of corruption, when you try to use the rules in a corrupt way. And that's when you know it's all hollowed out, because I appeal to the rules, and everybody laughs. I appeal to the tradition, and everybody laughs, because they know you killed your family. You're illegitimate. Well, what does that mean? Where does legitimacy rise? Boy, this sermon is changing as I talk. How does this world hold together? What is corruption? Corruption bleeds down and then it kills up. Because if you kick down, well, they will kick up. Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders of the units of 100 who were in charge of the troops, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said she must not be put to death in the temple of the Lord. Why? Well, this is when you say no to expedience. This is when you say no to yourself. This is when there's a rule that you obey. Well, there was a rule, no bloodshed in the temple, although that got broken, and you can find the text where it got broken. But what's behind the rule? Well, behind the rule is a story, and behind the stories are behaviors. And so now you can see how all of this is, in fact, constructed. Jehoiada then made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. They're renewing the covenant. Now, are there rules there? Yes, but it's not just rules. It's action, it's story, it's community, it's agreements of behavior, it's trust and understanding, and it's watching each other in very subtle ways that you get signals. Is this corrupt? How do I know? Once the jig is up, once corruption is shot through, well, then suddenly chaos emerges and bloodshed emerges. And this is part of the reason why it's the priest. There's a structure here. I made a comment. Now I'm way off the reservation in terms of this rough draft. This is no rough draft at all anymore. I'm freewheeling, baby, which means that I got a lot more work to do on this sermon. But I'm on video, and so might as well keep it up. One of the things I noted at our meetup last night, when we're wandering all over the place talking about Jordan Peterson and everything else under the sun, I mentioned that what you'll often see, typical at the end of the Roman Empire, why was it the church that in a sense replaces the empire? Because when all of the corrupt political institutions fall, it's usually the best organized and the most cohesive groups, and the groups with the least amount of corruption, that can in fact reconstitute the people. And then the other institutions, the political institutions, the economic institutions, then grow within the religious institutions and then eventually outgrow them. And in fact, one way to understand the 1,000 years that are the Middle Ages, from roughly 500, the decay and corruption of the Roman Empire, to 1500, in a sense, the supremacy of political, economic, other institutions that, in a sense, after 1500 start to overshadow the church. And what we've seen in the church is a continual loss of prestige as these other institutions rise. We see, well, this is what happens with corruption. Now, what happens often with institutions will outgrow the actual confidence and fidelity and trust that create them. And once an institution outgrows its trust, the corruption value goes higher and higher and higher, and then eventually collapses. And then you get the kind of chaos and bloodshed that we see happening here in the story. My sermon is going to be totally different from this. I got a lot to do on this sermon. So all the people of the land went to smash the temple of Baal. Oops, we hadn't been told this. Someone had built a temple of Baal in Jerusalem. I wonder who. It was probably Athaliah. Why? Well, Jezebel built the temple of Baal in Samaria, and probably Athaliah built the temple of Baal in Jerusalem. And so now the people smash it. Now, how many different tribal aspects can you look at this? They probably looked at Athaliah as a foreign queen. So you've got nationalism going here. You've got religious nationalism going here. So anyway, first they kill Athaliah, then they go to the temple of Baal and they tear it down. They smashed the altars and the idols to pieces, and they killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Now pay attention. They didn't kill in the temple in Jerusalem, in the temple of the Lord, but they did kill in the temple of Baal. Why? Well, they are expressing sacredness. Okay, they are expressing allegiance to the Lord. Now, if you remember the destruction of the temple of Baal in Samaria, after they destroyed it and burned it, how was it used in town? As a toilet. Now, if you go zoom all the way to the New Testament to Jesus' time, there's Gehenna, the valley near Jerusalem that had been used for pagan sacrifice, human sacrifice during some of the eras of the bad kings. And this one then was used as a garbage dump. In other words, the people are acting out their ideas of clean and unclean, sacred, common, and profane. And so what we see happening here in Jerusalem is, in fact, religious reform. It's nationalism, perhaps. But Jehoiada, who has just engineered this whole thing, the priest posted guards at the temple of the Lord. So you have the army and the priests, and together they're bringing down the queen, and they're going to put back the boy in the line of David back onto the throne. He took with him the commanders of hundreds, the Karaites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and together they brought the king down from the temple of the Lord. Pay attention to the symbolism. And he went into the palace, entering by way of the gate of the guards, and the king then took his place on the royal throne. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm, because Athaliah had been slain with the sword at the palace. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, which says something about who's probably pulling the strings. Now, Joash actually wound up to be a pretty good king. After 23 years, they're dealing with some corruption at the temple, because after 23 years, the priests weren't repairing the temple, and they were getting money, and chapter 12 goes through the money aspect. Now, the king wanted it repaired, so he negotiated with them to raise the money and repair it. Now, does this express corruption? Is this good or not good? Now, what they did eventually was they made a big enough collection of money, and they had lay people repair the temple, and then the comment is that the lay people were so happy to do it that no one had to check the accounts because everyone was totally honest with it. Now, again, what is this chapter about? These chapters are about corruption. And what it's saying is that there's a reform that happened. There was corruption that came into the monarchy, and there was potentially some corruption in the temple. And Joash, who was the product of some of this corruption, actually took some of that character and started to express it. And so just as corruption begets corruption, sometimes reform begets reform. And as the book of Ezekiel displays quite clearly, what is true in the temple gets played out in the streets. What is true in the religion gets played out in the action. Now, is this just about rules? That's not just about rules. It's about stories. It's conveyed by stories, because stories convey behaviors. And in terms of our face-to-face communications, we're watching ourselves very clearly. Our watchers are watching each other, and we're watching for corruption all the time, because if everyone is in it for themselves, we're not going to be in it for God, or for the kingdom, or for the king, or for the covenant, or for all of these things that demand sacrifice. Oh gosh, my brain is working through all this Jordan Peterson stuff right now. All these things that demand sacrifice if nobody else is. Okay, well, what's this about? This is about the community. Oh, I'm going to have to completely rewrite this sermon. So good or not good? Hazael, remember him? He got anointed 2 weeks ago. He's anointed by weeping Elisha, invades and threatens to destroy Jerusalem. Joash raids the temple treasury to pay for Hazael, to offer him tribute. Now, this is mentioned. Is this good or bad? Does this express trust or not trust? Is this expedient? Or is this an expression of character or corruption? We're not sure. The text doesn't say. It just lays it out there and, in a sense, invites us to discuss it. And this is often the way the Bible works. Again, there's the simplistic version of the Bible that says the Bible is a list of rules and you're supposed to keep the rules. Yeah. The Bible is a list of stories and you can find good guys and bad guys. Yeah. The Bible is actually a far more complicated book that has far more nuance. It was clearly written by scribes who were geniuses. If you understand the intricate ways this book functions and works and was developed. But many of these passages, oh yeah, the agenda, the author has an agenda and he's moving his agenda forward. But many of these passages are open-ended, and what they're really inviting us to do is to start to live into the passages and to begin to debate. How corrupt was Joash? How good of a king was Joash? Now, as in Kings, all of the kings have these summaries, and they did what's right in the eyes of the Lord, or they did what's wrong in the eyes of the Lord. It's a very extremely low resolution binary judgment. And so that stands. But the text is written in a way that we're invited to have our own judgments. In the eyes of the Lord, all the years Jehoiada was priest. Oh, was he only good in the years that the priest who raised him had influence over him? Was he in charge? Was the priest in charge? Was he a puppet? But he didn't destroy the high places. Now, this is a litany that gets repeated again and again and again in the book of Kings. And this is always seen as a negative thing, because these high places are a big source of religious corruption, because everybody's keeping their own little religious thing. And what the agenda of the book is to centralize. It's to firm up the hierarchy in order, hopefully, to resist corruption. But part of the difficulty is that, in fact, when you firm up a hierarchy, if you get corruption in the hierarchy, you start to invite, because what hierarchies and institutions do is they magnify power and they magnify control. And so once you get corruption in the institution or in the hierarchy, then you lose the whole hierarchy, because in effect the hierarchy only works on trust and reality that people trust and believe in. So what's the agenda behind that? Now, Jehoiada the priest didn't do it either. In other words, now, didn't he do it because he didn't have the confidence of the people? He didn't have the political chips. He didn't, if you really want to destroy the high places, maybe you need a military purge and you're good to put the nation under martial law, and then maybe you yourself will be the threat of an uprising. So they were probably working this kind of balance, so they didn't do that either. But then again, what does that mean? Are they corrupt? Are they not sufficiently fearful of the Lord at the top of the hierarchy that they'll allow other things beneath them? This entire passage is about corruption. And again, what we see is a rule. Don't be corrupt. Doesn't begin to deal with any of this. Doesn't begin to deal with reality. Now, is a rule, don't be corrupt, a bad rule? No, it's about as good a rule as you can think of. But it's not a terribly useful rule. It doesn't really illuminate or inform, again, because what people usually do with rules is they concoct a justification, usually built on stories, usually built on actions, usually built on their own read of a situation, to say, but this is an exception to the rule, so I am permitted to kill or to steal or to commit adultery. Now, killing, stealing, and committing adultery are about the three commandments we've got left in terms of our civic culture. Those are the three commandments that almost everyone will say: you should not kill, you should not steal, you should not commit adultery. False witness, that one's under debate right now. You shall not covet, gave that up a long time ago. Now, this doesn't sound good at all. As for the other events of the reign of Joash and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? His officials conspired against him. Corruption took him down. His officials conspired against him and assassinated him at Beth Milo on the road down to Silla. The officials who murdered him were Jozabad, son of Shimeath, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer. He died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. Amaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. Remember what the story is about? The story is about corruption. This is a story about a kingdom that reaches its height under David and Solomon, and a kingdom that slowly, after multiple generations, hundreds of years, gets corrupted. And that's how corruption works. It seeps, it penetrates, it works slowly. Don't be corrupt. Don't be evil. That rule's not a bulwark against anything. I am going to change the sermon completely. Would a no corruption rule help? I think almost anybody would say don't be corrupt. It's not like nobody agrees on this rule. I think you will find even the most determined atheist agreeing with a no corrupt rule. Is the text not clear about right and wrong? I'd say the text is quite clear about right and wrong, but the text isn't exhaustive in its clarity about right and wrong, especially in the ways that we implicitly read it. Because when we read these texts, we project ourselves into the characters, usually selectively, often in order to pull out of it the story we want or the message we want about ourselves. So there's always a lot of bias, or the message we want about our enemies. So some of you are listening to this passage and thinking about Obama. Some of you are listening to this passage and thinking about Trump. And I'm sure you can apply this passage to Obama and Trump, and probably the way you apply this passage says more about you than about the passage. I do it myself. I'm not going to do it now. The stories illuminate, but applications remain our own. Can we separate them into good guys and bad guys? And here's the thing. Jesus tells us to do things. Jesus remains very popular with people today, and I have this all the time. Even if you listen to Russell Brand, for example. Russell Brand, the Bible that Russell Brand likes to use is mostly just the Gospels and the stories of Jesus. He doesn't want to listen to Paul. He doesn't want to listen to the Old Testament. I just want Jesus. Well, why? Well, that's based on a snapshot of who he thinks Jesus is, based on a reading of the Gospels, but if I would sit down with him and we'd have a little bit of time, I think I would probably say, let's take a look at some of this Jesus in the Gospels. I think you might find some things that you might not appreciate because, point number one, Jesus talks more about hell than anybody else in the Bible. Point number two, Jesus quotes the Old Testament more than anyone else in the Bible. Now, you might like to imagine or frame Jesus as kind of a hippie-ish figure who's singing John Lennon's songs. You really will not get that Jesus from any of the Gospels. What you are seeing is some of Jesus' character, the love that he expresses for outliers, the criticism he has for corruption, and you take those elements and you say, oh, there's Jesus. Well, here's the thing about Jesus. If Jesus was really that kind of person, they wouldn't have bothered to kill him. As much of a historical record as I think just about anyone can glean from any select gospel passages at all was that Jesus really annoyed almost everyone and even disturbed his disciples who loved him dearly. To the degree that, in the midst of a fairly hot culture war, parties that could agree on almost nothing could all agree they would like their world without Jesus. That doesn't really tell us that Jesus was the kind of figure that if he came into your life, you wouldn't be significantly disturbed by him. That it would always be rainbows and unicorns and lovely walks hand in hand through the garden, which is how, quite frankly, a lot of emotionalistic, nostalgic Christians like to play this on both the right and the left. So there's a little mini sermon in the sermon for you, because I'm taking great liberties with Rough Draft for Sunday. People say Jesus is a moral model, but we're skeptical about the supernatural aspects of the story. All right, there's your cultural filter. But how do you relate to the story? How do you read yourself in it? Now again, someone might read this and say, aha, the corruption of Donald Trump. You can talk a lot about that. Some of you say, oh, Obama started the corruption. Okay, place the corruption where you want it. All of us will agree there's corruption. Probably we'll disagree on who's corrupt and who isn't. Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. How do they help people obey the rules or be less corrupt? Now again, I would argue that if you read this story, the story is way more informative than a don't be corrupt rule. Because if you read the story, certain things become obvious to just about anyone. Sure, there are multiple interpretations of the story. Sure, you can pull the story out of the text and try to interpret it in your own way. But I would argue, I have a 2 o'clock appointment, but I would argue the story does a fair amount of bringing it in itself. And good narrative, well-written literature does that. It makes its point. On one end, it's open-ended enough so that we can enter into it, but it's also focused enough so that it is compelling and moving and persuasive. That's what stories do. Stories persuade. Life is complicated. If you tried to write rules for life, and I thought there were 12 rules for life. Rules for life. I'm doing this in front of a whole bunch of Jordan Peterson fans. You see, how corrupt is Vanderklay in terms of his working Jordan Peterson to try and claw his way up the Jordan Peterson hierarchy? Well, you can be the judge. But rules for life, not my favorite approach. Can rules help? Sure. But they're illustrative more in fact than they're binding, especially in a context like we're dealing with. If you try to write rules for life, you can make an endless list with endless wranglings. And people can only keep in mind one thing at a time. What people have a real capacity for is story, and also poetry, but we've sort of lost that in our culture. Hierarchies of ideas develop. And in Christianity, following the Old Testament, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. But then Jesus acts in a way that isn't easy to distill into rules. He's clearly not corrupt. And how do we know he's not corrupt? Because of his death. It is a story at the edges. You can't get a bigger story, and for Jordan Peterson people, you've heard him say archetypal story. You can't get a bigger story than one perfect man dying for the sins of the whole world. This only works, however, to make you less corrupt if you believe it. Okay, the story might be inspirational. The story might be aspirational, but most people would say, yeah, it's pretty extreme. Because then essentially what Jesus says, if you give your life, you get another, better one, not subject to corruption or decay, which is the resurrection. So you believe this man was incorruptible, because remember, it starts at the top. How will you respond? Do you see your own corruption? That's always the hard part, because you really need other people to tell you, because we have too many biases protecting our egos from our sin, which is why in Christian tradition, part of the job of the Holy Spirit is not to give us good feelings when we listen to Christian music, to give us miraculous powers when we want to heal our friends. Part of the power of the Holy Spirit is to convict us of sin. Why? Because it's in the conviction of sin that we begin the process of sanctification, of our improvement, of our growth into Christ, of becoming more like Christ, you have to be terribly secure to be honestly critical of yourself. Well, how do you get terribly secure? Well, what if the God of the universe loves you and has saved you and has done all of these things for you to the degree that, and this is where my Calvinism comes through, you are so firmly in his hand that, Romans 8, nothing can separate you from his love. If you have that kind of security, now maybe I can get to work on the kinds of deceptions and biases and corruptions that are in my own heart. Do you see him dying to forgive your corruption? Because that's it. Because unless it's persuasive, unless you feel it deep in your bones, unless you believe it at a very deep level, you're not going to live it, because we're way too corrupt. Do you believe he gives us his Spirit to become like him? And then this Sunday we end with communion. So this started out as rough draft for Sunday. Maybe this is a new draft for Sunday, and there's a whole bunch of Jordan Peterson thoughts in here. So that's just kind of the way it works sometimes. Looks like I have a lot more work to do before Sunday. So thanks for watching.